few words about myself beyond the introduction that you heard. I am now, as you know, the president of Spelman College, but I am a clinical psychologist by training. And perhaps like some of you, I know that not all of you, I don't know this, so let me ask, how many of you started in Teach for America as core members in a classroom? Most of you, not everyone, but most of you did. So what I started to say is perhaps like you, when you were in college, before you decided to do Teach for America, I'm imagining that you weren't necessarily thinking you were going to go into education. Is that a true statement? Okay, so when I was in college and then later in graduate school, I was not thinking about going into education either. I was, as I said, a clinical psychologist by training, and my intention was to be a therapist, working with children and families. And it was while I was a graduate student that I had the opportunity to both do some clinical work as a therapist, but also do some teaching. And for the first part of my career, I did both. Clinical work, working with college students initially and some children and families as a therapist, but also doing some teaching. And the first major teaching opportunity beyond my University of Michigan graduate school experience was at the University of California, Santa Barbara. While I was at UCSB, that was back in 1980, I was just newly married, and my husband and I were living there, and I was working part-time at the university in the campus counseling center doing therapy, but also had the opportunity to do a little teaching in the Black Studies department. And there was a course in the Black Studies department called Group Exploration of Racism that was required for Black Studies majors. And if you know anything about UCSB, the population of color, particularly African American students, was then quite small and still pretty small. It's probably the least diverse of the UC campuses. And so even though this was a course being taught in the Black Studies department, most of the students who took it were actually white students. There were, some students of color, but mostly white students taking this class. But it hadn't been taught for a while, and they needed somebody to teach it. And the other faculty members in the department didn't want to teach it because it had a title like Group Exploration of Racism. And when you read the description of the course, it was focused on group interaction, a lot of interactive exercises. It wasn't your traditional kind of talk and chalk, lecture format. And I had not taken or studied how to teach about race in my graduate program. But as a clinical psychologist, I had learned how to facilitate groups. And so when someone asked me to do this class on group exploration of racism, I thought, how hard could it be, right? Perhaps some of you thought that. How hard could it be? So I started teaching this class. I was, at the time, about 25, 26 years old, and looked like I was about 16. And I was in this class with these white students teaching this course on racism, and I found it was kind of challenging. It was challenging for a lot of reasons, but as I got better at it, and even though I wasn't, I was inexperienced, I was an inexperienced instructor, I did have a guidebook, which I should mention because it was very helpful to me, and it was called, what was it called? It was a book that talked about, I can see it now, Handbook for White Awareness. That was the title of it. Handbook for White Awareness by a woman named Judy Katz, K-A-T-Z. And it was full of exercises and films and discussion ideas about how to raise the awareness of white people about understanding issues of race. And so using that book as kind of a Bible, really, as a guide to my class syllabus, I began teaching this class. And even though I was not very experienced, and I might even today say not even that good at it, at the end of the semester, my students wrote messages on their evaluations like, "This class has changed my life. This is the most powerful learning experience I've ever had. Every student should be required to take this class." And so even though I didn't really, I would say today, even though I didn't really know what I was doing, it was a very powerful impact. And so I did it again. And then it got a little better, and I kept doing it, and before you know it, it was my specialty, teaching this course on racism. And when I left UC Santa Barbara, a couple of years later, they were on the trimester system, so 3 semesters in a year. I had probably done it 9 times, and went on to my next teaching position at Westfield State, essentially saying to the people who hired me, if you hire me, I'm going to teach a course on the psychology of racism. That's sort of condition of my employment. And they said, if you want to, and so I did it there, and then I did it at Mount Holyoke, and 20 years later, it has been certainly the most powerful teaching experience I have ever had, though I've taught lots of other things in addition. But I want to share with you a little bit of what I learned about that in that teaching experience, some of which, of course, I've written about, many of you have read Why Are All the Black Kids, and you know that there's a lot in there from my teaching experience. But I want to share it with you in the context of some of the dialogue that I understand is taking place at Teach for America around identity and what that means in the classroom, what it means to engage with students who look like you or who do not look like you, or all of that as it relates to the diversity statement of Teach for America. And one of the things that I learned teaching mostly white students, though always racially mixed classes, over this 20-year period, was that talking about race heightens people's sense of their racial identity in ways that silence does not. Does that make sense? Talking about race heightens people's awareness of their racial identity. That's true for people of color. It is especially true for white people. Because when you start to think about racism as it operates in our society, and if you start to think about it and understand it as a systemic advantage, you start to think of yourself as either privileged or disadvantaged in that context. For white participants in my class, one of the things I found was that it was really hard for white students to begin to think of themselves as white. That it was very challenging because they would say, I am an individual. I'm an individual. I don't, maybe I am white, and maybe you're African American or Asian American or Latino or Native American or, however you might choose to identify, multiracial. But I'm an individual, and I want to be seen as an individual. And one of the things that I found teaching in that class was that it was really a challenge. That experience of giving up because it was a giving up of one's identity as an individual was really hard because it just was a completely new paradigm. And when people think of themselves as members of groups, some of us grow up knowing that we're a member of a group. If you grow up in an environment as a person of color, or I grew up in a predominantly white environment in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. And I certainly knew in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, that I was African American. Not that people called me names but I knew that I was different from the other kids in my class. And in my experience in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, I was often the only black kid in the class. So I had an awareness of that from probably an early age. And I understood from an early age that when people saw me, they didn't just see Beverly Tatum, or at that time Beverly Daniel, but they saw me as Beverly Daniel, the black girl in the class, right? Or I had other identities, and we all have multiple identities. My father was a professor at Bridgewater State College, first African-American professor at Bridgewater State. And so I also had the identity of Dr. Daniel's daughter. I had the identity of, my brother was a pretty well-known musician in the community. I had an identity of, Eric Daniel's sister. I had lots of different identities, but I understood that one of those identities was related to my race and gender. My white friends, and I had white friends, did not think of themselves as